Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Right to Know, your weekly Pennsylvania policy podcast from the PLS Reporter. I'm Justin Schweitzer, joined as always by my partner in crime here at PLS, Sam Zern. Sam, how are you this week?
I'm doing well. It's been a pretty good week, looking at a rainy weekend, but can't complain too much.
You win some, you lose some. I do think I spy a new plant in the background. Is that a new one?
Yes, it is. It is a money tree. I have to learn how to train it to braid because that's a cool thing it does, and I have no idea how to do that. But yes, I have a lot of new plants, and if you watch on YouTube, you'll notice that my plant changes every episode. So go back through and you can see all of my little friends. But at some point, I'm gonna have to start getting a few more because I'm starting to run out of episodes worth of plants.
Did you say a money tree?
Yes.
Does it give birth to money like oranges or something?
I think it has to do with like how the leaves feel. I actually have no idea. It was a birthday gift that just showed up at my doorstep. So thanks, mom. But yeah, so I love it if it's my aesthetic.
Darn, that's disappointing. If it starts sprouting dollar bills, let me know.
I'll give you some.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So from plants to policy, there was, I'm glad you like that transition. From plants to policy, it was a strange session week this week. The House was in session. There were some bills moved. We'll get into one of those later, but I think where we're going to start off this week is there were multiple public hearings on some pretty, contentious cultural issues in abortion and whether or not to allow transgender girls to participate on, women's school sports teams. These were both issues that Sam focused heavily on this week. She kind of picked up some slack because I was out of commission on Wednesday for jury selection, so that's much appreciated. I was not selected, for the record, probably by nature of my area of employment. But anyway, we won't get into the judiciary this week. But Sam, again, these are two very contentious sort of cultural flashpoints. And I'll let you just kind of start off wherever you want to. So without further ado, the microphone is yours.
All right, so I guess we'll start chronologically. We knew last week on Friday that there was going to be a press conference about a bill that showed up on Monday, a bill that would prevent transgender girls from playing on school sports teams for women. This is not surprising, honestly, that this was introduced at all. If you've been following the national media, there is a huge, like, nationwide Republican push right now to limit the ability of trans athletes in general, but particularly trans girls, from playing on the teams, with other girls of their gender. And so that's like been a national push. Currently, it goes back some time. We've had a lot of pushes for anti-trans legislation in this country for years now, but this most latest wave is kind of in the last few months as legislators, are kicking off the new year. And in some states, there's been like a lot more movement and action. We saw in Arkansas, a bill went through limiting trans participation in sports and healthcare. Those were vetoed by the governor, and now I believe both were overturned. I believe. I need to check on that. I've been focusing too much on Pennsylvania. But all that to just kind of set the scene of why this came up in Pennsylvania this week. Was not unexpected at all to see this bill introduced. Now, it was introduced by a group of 5 Republican women lawmakers. They're calling it the Fairness in Women's Sports Act. And they're really posing it as a women's rights issue. They're purporting that trans girls will take spots from cisgender women on sports teams, using a lot of pretty outdated and inaccurate science to make the argument that trans girls are like necessarily better athletes or that kind of thing. Now, I'm saying trans girls. I wanna be clear here. Throughout the entire press conference that was held on Monday, the word trans was not said until the reporters started talking. The lawmakers were using a transphobic term, biological males, the whole time. Um, to kind of set that, it's to speak to the gender dynamic that they are talking about with this legislation. So that was like, that choice of words was very particular there. Um, but what that really means is trans girls participating in girl sports. Um, Now, so this bill, it's not going to go anywhere. Well, okay, I shouldn't say that. It has very little likelihood of going too far. I think it was at that press conference. Um, shoot, Barbara Gleim. I was getting my press conferences mixed up this week. Representative Gleim said that she had not heard from the majority leadership yet whether or not this would be called to the floor. And the governor has already said multiple times now, like, yeah, he's going to veto any of this, like, immediately, if it were to get to that point. And I talked to some advocates with the Pennsylvania Youth Congress, and they were similarly like, this isn't going to go into law. Um, this is much more of a political base rallying tool right now. So that's kind of like where we stood with that press conference. I have a lot more details in the story I wrote about it, but that's kind of like the basic overview of what that press conference was like on Monday, and kind of how that set. I don't know. It's kind of setting a tone right now for some of the policy going forward. I think it was particularly interesting just to see Pennsylvania Republicans step out of Pennsylvania and into this big national push. Not unexpected, like I said, but it does. There was a question asked. I'm pausing a lot in this. There was a question asked during the press conference that was essentially asking, is this a solution in search of a problem? Like, are we seeing, what the lawmakers are defining as a problem of some sort of like trans girls taking over women's sports? And that's not happening at all. Trans women have been allowed on sports teams for decades and have been successfully playing on sports teams for decades, with none of the fears that were brought up during that press conference really being realized. So yeah, I mean, it's essentially, you can look at any legislature right now that's doing these similar bills and see kind of similar to what's happening in Pennsylvania. I think what's unique about Pennsylvania in this conversation is that we have a governor that's already said no. And so we're likely not to see some of the same like results that are happening over in, Idaho. Arkansas has enough of a supermajority to overturn. I don't believe Pennsylvania would be able to get that supermajority, even if, we got through both chambers to the governor to a veto. So, it was very much, it did feel very much like a kind of more of a political point than necessarily legislation that's going to move, which, I don't say that to be disparaging to any legislators that may introduce legislation as a political point. That's a lot of what happens in Harrisburg. But yeah, so I mean, while it is like a big deal because it's part of this national conversation, it's not really going anywhere, I imagine.
Right. And how did Democrats take this? You touched on Pennsylvania Youth Congress a little bit. I know some members of the LGBTQ caucus kind of weighed in as well. What was their response like?
Oh, immediate dismissal, calling it transphobic, saying it's not really like an issue even, and calling out some of the transphobia in the language that was used, and targeting trans girls, particularly youth. This is about youth in college sports, and then also really purporting that the point that the Republican lawmakers were making, which is that they wanted to see women's sports be supported, and they were posing trans girls as a threat to that. Democrats are saying that's incredibly unfounded. The actual threats to women's sports are underfunding, sexual harassment, lack of media coverage, lack of resources, and all that is, very much something that can be legislated and worked on. But this idea that trans girls are somehow a threat to sports, is just unfounded.
So there's a huge rift there into, what the major problem facing women's sports even is. That's
Exactly.
what it sounds
Yeah.
like from my perspective here.
Yeah, and it's Democrats are they're kind of twofold on this. One, that the bill as introduced is transphobic. Two, that if we want to talk women's sports, we can talk women's sports. This issue is not the problem in women's sports. This isn't even an issue, I say. The problem in women's sports is lack of funding and, attention and all that kind of thing. And that affects trans women too. They are also on women's sports teams. And so they're impacted by those lacks of funding and those lack of resources. But then they also benefit from all the great things that sports participation does. One thing that I think was interesting, and this is just, no policy point here, but there was a reporter on Twitter, as we all are, talking about this issue of, talking about the press conference and saying essentially, maybe we should have a conversation of what's the point of sports anyways? What is the purpose of our sports teams if not just giving kids an outlet to have fun, build these bonds, these memories, and that kind of thing. And that should be extended to all kids. So that was kind of a point that I thought was, if we're going to scale out even further from this conversation, what do these sports mean at all to people? It's not just this, competitive, scholarship-driven environment. It's, recreation and entertainment and athleticism and health. All these things that are important for all kids, regardless of sex designated at birth.
So we've kind of examined here how, again, very, two diametrically opposed stances on this issue between Democrats and Republicans. Wolf I shouldn't say he isn't likely. He's made clear that he wouldn't sign something like this. And I think that kind of piggybacks well into the other kind of major cultural issue that was addressed in Harrisburg this week that, is obviously abortion. So again, paint us a little picture of, what happened regarding that subject area this week.
Yeah, so like a week or two ago, Kathy Rapp, she's the chair of the House Health Committee.
Republican chair. Majority chair,
yeah. She announced that there were going to be hearings on abortion. Specifically, they're going to focus on some abortion legislation that's in the works, but this first one was just about like statistics. So we knew this was coming, we also knew this was coming. Abortion bills are, a regular topic in every legislature. I don't know that they're annual. I don't know how the conversation was before I got here. I assume COVID kind of put a lot of our very typical flashpoints on pause, I think, during the last legislative cycle, but a lot of those are coming back now, and abortion is obviously
one of those issues that doesn't go away.
Exactly. So we knew this was coming, and I talked to Representative Rapp ahead of it, and she said that the first hearing, which we saw this week, was going to be about statistics, follow-up Department of Health procedures on like reporting abortions in the state, and then going ahead, they're going to be looking at 3 specific bills: a fetal remains bill, a Down syndrome abortion ban, and a cardiac activity ban. Those are sometimes called heartbeat bills, but one of the things about abortion legislation in general that's, I think, worth digging into, and now this is for people who are far more in it than I am, is the different language we hear. It's a very, very charged language conversation. So, you might hear that one bill called a heartbeat bill. A lot of people say that heartbeat is not necessarily accurate to what the cardiac activity that ultrasounds pick up is, actually measuring. That aside, we've got 3 bills that have been introduced before that have had some amount of movement in the past. And now with these public hearings are going to get lifted again a little bit more. I realize I'm all over the place today. I'm very sorry, listeners. I'm using a lot of scattered language. I'll just encourage you to go read my written work where I have an editor.
Shameless plug.
Exactly. But yeah, so that's essentially what we heard this week is these abortion hearings started. Governor Wolf said in 2019 he will never sign a bill that would limit abortion. So that's kind of, again,
Pretty cut and dry.
Yeah, pretty straightforward response there from the governor. When I asked Representative Rapp about that, she said, she always hopes to change his heart, but that's what all lawmakers hope when they introduce legislation like this. So we'll see in the coming weeks when the next more legislative focused hearings happen, what the conversation will shift to. But, I talked to a policy director from Planned Parenthood who essentially said that similar to my conversations with advocates about the trans bill, that this is a policy moment. It's kind of revving up a base. It's not actually going to go anywhere. And she very strongly felt like it was a waste of the health committee's time to be talking about abortion when we're in the midst of a pandemic. Felt very strongly that this was not the best use of the committee's time. So that's kind of the rundown of where we're at with this week in abortion.
I think, from my perspective and just being in Harrisburg the last 2 years and kind of seeing the abortion debate unfold, we did have the Down syndrome abortion ban bill advance through the legislature, and I believe it got to the governor's desk and he vetoed it. And, he was pretty clear at the time that, any sort of restrictions on abortion would be met with a veto, once they made it to his desk. And I think you also mentioned the fetal remains legislation as well. I don't remember if that made it through the Senate. I think it made it through the House.
Yes, it did not. It died in committee in the Senate,
Okay.
or did committee and then just did what bills do in committee do.
Yeah, I do remember, that also, kind of galvanized a pretty intense debate, touching on both abortion and, miscarriages and, whatever else may occur. So, I think to your point, the likelihood of these bills becoming law in the next year and a half is pretty much zero. But I think where this does get interesting is, if the governor's office, changes hands from Democrat to Republican in 2022, what that could mean for, abortion, obviously, but, a whole number of, cultural battles that are, playing out in states, whether it's, school sports or, there's a whole range of things that legislatures are considering that, haven't really gained a lot of traction in Pennsylvania because a Democrat holds the governor's office. So I think that will be a really, kind of fascinating thing to watch as the gubernatorial campaigns start to kind of rev up in the coming year and a half.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think coming from Texas and then Tennessee into Pennsylvania, I'm seeing a very different relationship between the legislature and the governor's office, obviously. But I keep an eye on all my outlets from Texas and Tennessee, and a lot of times what I see happening over there, there's a few week lag time before it hits the Republican caucuses in Pennsylvania, but then we have this added governorship that's not generally supportive of particular things like trans sports or trans athletes' participation in sports, abortion restrictions, that kind of thing. So, it's just definitely interesting to use those other states as almost like a bellwether of what's going to get introduced. But I know that the conversation always looks incredibly different when it hits Harrisburg because we have this split in power.
Divided government, yeah.
Exactly. And so, come election season, which I don't want to say is coming soon because it's
It'll
election season. That'll be very interesting to see if anything changes hands, because I know we said a few weeks ago that Pennsylvania's state house was kind of like the Democratic National Committee, the campaign.
Legislative Campaign Committee, I think.
Yes, that one. They kind of had their eyes on Pennsylvania as a potential like state where the houses or the General Assembly might flip. Political prognostication is not my thing. Also,
so you won't get it on this podcast.
And it's frequently incredibly hard to actually figure out where a state's going to lean. But I mean, yeah, we're coming down to the end of this governor's term. So a lot of these things that are getting introduced now, who knows what will happen to them if the governorship changes parties, if the legislature changes hands. Like, I don't know, there's like an interesting kind of feeling at the end of, as we're getting to the end of the term here. Yeah, I mean, it's still long.
Right.
Just because 2020 went astronomically fast does not mean that the rest of this term is going to go that fast.
For sure. There's still a good year and a half left in Wolf's term, so exactly. A lot can happen in a year and a half in Harrisburg. But Sam, you did mention just kind of broadly legislation that faces, sort of an uncertain future. And that gives me a good opportunity here to kind of segue into a bill that was actually passed out of the House this week. It was House Bill 951, sponsored by Mark Rozzi, and it would create, and this is going to be a little bit of deja vu here because we've talked about this issue at length a lot recently, but House Bill 951 was passed by the House, and it would create a 2-year statutory window allowing child sex abuse survivors for whom the statute of limitations has expired to sue their abusers. And if that sounds familiar, it's because both chambers last month passed a proposed constitutional amendment to do the same thing, but do it through the constitutional process, because Senate Republicans in particular have had concerns about whether doing it through a normal bill would be constitutional. Sam and I have, again, talked at length about, kind of how we got here. A constitutional amendment was advanced last session. It was going to be on the ballot this session. Department of State, messed up and had an error that derailed the whole constitutional amendment process. So the legislature started over last month, passed the amendment again, and the House this week decided to, amend that statutory language, the statutory window, into a bill and move that as well. And, that's been something that Democrats in both chambers have been calling for. Some, obviously some Republicans, because, Republicans and Democrats voted to, move that statutory window bill across the finish line this week. But now it kind of enters a dark place where we don't know, what's going to happen to the bill next, if the Senate's going to take it up. Because Senate Republican leaders were pretty clear that, they didn't think an emergency amendment, was called for. They, in the past did not believe that creating a 2-year legal window was constitutional, or they didn't believe it was constitutional in the statutory form. So, now that leaves a lot of question marks as to, what happens to 951 next. Does it just kind of languish in committee? And Sam reached out to a spokesperson for Senator Kim Ward, the Senate Majority Leader, who just kind of re-stressed that the Senate had already passed the constitutional amendment, and that, in the months to come, the Senate is, going to be focusing its efforts on allocating, federal COVID-19 stimulus dollars, reopening the state's economy, and passing a budget, because that's going to be here before we know it. So, there really wasn't a mention of whether or not 951 would be on the Senate's agenda in the next few weeks, or, this year at all, really. So, I mean, it's, something we saw progress on this week. It moved out of the House, which, is a big step, and I'm sure one that's welcomed by, proponents of the bill and, proponents of, statute of limitations reforms. But, as we sometimes like to break out our, magic 8 ball here on the podcast, I would say outlook not so good, with that bill over there in the Senate. So I kind of rambled on a lot there, but that's sort of just an update on this. And, Sam, I know you actually covered this and wrote about it this week. So is there anything that, you think I glossed over?
I don't think so. I mean, I think like you said, the Senate response was somewhat lukewarm. I do agree that I think this week was odd in the way things moved, the type of kind of
Just the pace was strange.
the Flashpoint press conference and hearing. This all comes, and now this is me getting fully into like predicting the future mode here.
Uh-oh.
This comes as we're about to finish these election hearings that have been happening in the state government committee for weeks now. The final one is next Thursday. And as we're finishing, I think, are we done with budget hearings yet, or just about?
If we're not done, we're almost done. I think
Yeah.
we might have wrapped them up.
Yeah, so I think that this week has been a little bit, I think a lot of what happened this week is going to get backburnered very swiftly when we get into whatever leadership has been planning for the post election hearings in the state government committee, like whatever legislation might get introduced coming out of that, and budget season. So yeah, I mean, those are going to be, I think, the big focuses that I say, yeah, Harrisburg and Harrisburg reporters are going to be kind of diving into, and you're already seeing it a lot with, conversations about voting to this point. What happened in Georgia? Is that coming to Pennsylvania? How's Pennsylvania compared to other states? So I think the conversation is going to very quickly shift to voting in the next week. So we'll keep watching some of the stuff that we talked about, but
I bet we will.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to get real exciting real fast.
Just for the record, budget hearings are not over. The Senate still has some the week of the 19th, but not next week.
Okay, so
I believe.
Thank you for checking me there. So a little bit longer for budget, but second half of April, first half of May are going to be, I think, pretty intense, as far as a lot of information coming from the State House all at once.
For sure, and then before we know it, it'll be budget time. So never dull here in Harrisburg, and as you know, we will be here to keep you updated each week here on Right to Know. And if you want to check out all those future episodes or episodes of the past, you can find us at righttoknow.podbean.com or wherever you like to get your podcasts. So Spotify, iTunes, iHeart. Actually, does iTunes exist anymore? I remember there were maybe, I don't know. Your favorite podcast platform, and that includes YouTube now. So if you want to, watch us, kind of debate and review these. We don't debate. If you want to watch us, review and examine the issues of the week, you can also find us on our YouTube channel. And obviously, and Sam has already, given a shameless plug or two for the website. But if you want to read our written coverage, you can find us at theplsreporter.com, where you can subscribe for just $16.67 a month. If you don't have a subscription, you can see 1 to 2 free stories a week that we push out on our Twitter, Facebook, and even Reddit. So if you're a Reddit fan, you can even find us in certain subreddits, on that massive website. And that's all Sam's doing. She's the Reddit master here. But what am I missing, Sam? Oh, we have a new newsletter. Each Saturday morning, we send out the Reporter Rewind, which is a weekly sort of recap on the news of the week in Harrisburg. So if there's anything you may have missed, we try and kind of comb over the main topics of the week and also kind of shine a spotlight on one major issue. So if you have not signed up for the Reporter Rewind, you can head to our website at theplsreporter.com and use the Eye Opener newsletter form on the right side of the screen. And as Sam also mentioned, we're all very active on Twitter. Might be a reporter thing, but that's kind of where the Pennsylvania politics community lives. So if you want to give us a follow, you can follow our outlet at the PLS Reporter, and you can follow myself at Justin_Schweitzer.
I'm at Sam_Zern.
And thanks for tuning in this week. It's going to be a bit rainy, I think, but still try and enjoy the weather. It's getting a bit nicer out there. So thanks again for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.